and then I can maintain size in a way that it's not hurting my ear to try and carry around this football. Yeah.
On the back of your ear.
Yeah, things like that.
Podcast. Welcome to this episode of the eCoustics podcast. I'm eCoustics producer and the host of this episode, and Mitch Anderson is my name. And on this one, we have someone that I love introducing. Every single time I love introducing him. And I was reflecting yesterday when this episode came to be on who William Jennings is to me. And to eCoustics, he's the headphones and portables editor. But to me, I put him in the category of some of my most beloved professors, who I still have relationships with since college. And I have learned so much from this guy in ways about tech that I don't have a lot of experience with. And that being portables, headphones, DACs, all the above, and tubes we've had a lot of conversations about. And so having William on this episode just to have some conversation with me about where wireless headphone tech is here in June of 2025 and where it's going is something I'm really looking forward to. So thank you, William, for being here, man. Welcome.
Well, thanks for having me. Always fun. And I think that was the really polite way to say this is a nerd. This is our geek of the bunch.
But to be fair, though, I mean, I wasn't speaking any fallacies.
No, you weren't wrong. I'm just saying it's a very polite way to say it. But,
so you mentioned something in the green room here before we started, and the line that you delivered to me, which I think is a perfect jumping off point, is that you said, so where we are a little bit with wireless tech in 2025 with headphones and stuff is don't let perfection get in the way of good enough. And what were you getting at with that as we lead in?
Well, I think there's this tendency to compare wireless products with the best of wired products and say they're not there yet. And sure. It's been a banner year for some of those things. I've had the Carbon 2 in from Odyssey. That's a fantastic electrostat. I just got done with the Susvara Unveiled from Hi-Fi Man. That's just a crazy good, planar magnetic. There are some really spectacular, wired headphones out there, and there aren't any wireless ones that compete with those yet. But you know what? I sit there listening to things like that, and I realize that even the air conditioner kicking in is affecting what I'm hearing. And when you stop and think about it for a little while, when you start talking about having to soundproof your home, so you get the full benefit of your headphone, at what point do we really need a wireless headphone that competes at that level? And I think that's kind of the point I was starting with don't let perfection be the enemy of good enough, in that if you're sitting on a bus, you really don't need a wireless headphone to be as good as a Susvara Unveiled. You wouldn't be able to do anything with it if it was.
That's true.
Or nothing more than you can do with something a lot cheaper. And I think that's the point to a lot of people. And I think that's it's kind of the things we've seen in the market. I'll pick on a couple of them that are sort of holy grails to some people and I think don't belong there. The first one is battery life.
Okay.
We see it all the time that battery life in the ANC segment, particularly on in-ears, there's this idea that it has to last 8 hours, that they ought to last at least a full workday on a charge. That's what everybody is shooting for in the market right now. That it has to last a whole workday on a charge. But reality is, how many of us actually leave a set of in-ears in for 8 hours straight?
I don't know.
Yeah, at some point you go to lunch, you have a conversation with a coworker, you do something else. Very few people have an 8-hour listening session.
Right. I mean, I've fallen asleep with some in, but I think I woke up sooner than 8 hours to get them out of my ears.
Well, and even if they went dead at some point during that 8-hour period, did you really care? Yeah. And I think that's one of those things where, is that really the benchmark we ought to be using?
Mm-hmm.
And I think ANC is very much that way too, and that we keep talking about how well they can get rid of absolutely everything. That it didn't do as well as this one at getting rid of this sound. I don't know that getting rid of it really ought to be the target so much as making it not the center of attention. If it can reduce it enough that it's not distracting, then how much better than that does it really need to be?
You bring up a good point there, because I find it a little bit uncomfortable when I'm listening to like ANC headphones that are like superb at what they do and there's no noise floor, where then it makes it feel like I'm in an augmented reality of the physical space I'm existing in,
Yeah, there are people where the really good ANC actually makes them sick. I mean, physically sick. It's kind of almost a vertigo situation.
Yeah, like a chamber.
Well, yeah, if you've ever been in a chamber, those will drive you nuts. You can hear your own heartbeat in your ears, and it's amazing how loud we as a human being are when there's no other noise to compete with you.
Right.
So, but yeah, the same kind of thing here with, how good does ANC really need to be functional? Because I find most of the time I don't use it. And the reason most of the time I don't use it is because most of the time it adversely affects the sound signature more than it reduces distraction.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm on a bus or a plane or, I'm traveling, that's a great case for ANC. Okay. I can get rid of a lot of the droning noise in the background. There I'll use it. But when I'm at home and it's voices and it's noises and it's things around the house or things around the office, one, ANC doesn't do that bang up a job of reducing high frequency noise anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So chances are you're still going to get some of it through. Two, passive isolation does a pretty good job at removing some of it for you if you're wearing a closed bag.
That's true.
So there are a number of factors there where, is it really worth cranking up the ANC and potentially destroying the sound quality in doing so for what little benefit you oftentimes get out of it? So again, I think.
Are they taking that battery life? When you're talking about battery life lasting a full 8 hours, is the goal of the majority of manufacturers that you've seen, or is it the want of the consumer of that 8-hour battery life being that long with like full on noise cancellation?
Yeah, I think there's a competition going on to be able to say, we can outlast our competitor. So I think some of it is driven by consumer. I think some of it's driven by market competition.
Okay.
But I question how realistic the goal is, regardless of who's driving it. It's kind of one of those, to go back to other references that are popular right now, going back to the 24 hours Le Mans. That's a great race, but who drives a car for 24 hours straight at 100 plus miles an hour? Yeah, I mean, it doesn't exactly tell you how your Chevy's going to do come Tuesday.
That's a great analogy too. And when it comes to the battery life stuff, these are just genuine questions from me. And for the listeners, if you have other questions that you want answered about any of this stuff, put them in the comments of the episode or on eCoustics.com or on the YouTube, whatever, and we'll get back to you on them. These are just questions I have. So when a manufacturer is shooting for like an 8-hour battery life with ANC enabled, blah, blah, blah. What would that be? Over ear, close back, open back, in ear. It doesn't matter. We're talking about the 8 hours thing with ANC. If that's the goal, then what is like the cost and what's like the loss then? If you're putting that much R&D and hype into the battery life, what are you losing out on?
Well, first off, when you say the battery life and the ANC, you have to understand those two are mutually exclusive. Those are competitive forces, because the better your ANC is, the more horsepower you have to have, the more CPU you have to have, and that's battery intensive.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Right.
So the first thing you can do to extend your battery life is to degrade the ANC.
Mm-hmm.
If I don't have as much going on there, I can draw the battery life out longer. assuming that's not an option.
Okay.
That I don't want to degrade the ANC because then I'm not on the same plane with my competitors. So I have to keep my ANC at least up to par. Then the other angle is to put in a bigger battery, which the obvious downfall there is bigger battery means bigger case, redesign. Particularly for in-ears, bigger is awkward sometimes. You've got a limited amount of space to work with, things like that. So it's a matter of weight. It's a matter of design. Some things like that, and that every time you step up that battery a size, you got to find a place to put it. And particularly with in-ears, that can be problematic. When you look at some of these that are out there today, not to pick on Sony, but you look at the XM5, it's got a big bulb behind the earpiece or the driver itself. That's where all the electronics and the battery are sitting.
Okay.
When you look at the size of the Bose, quiet comforts, some of that space is battery, so that's the better your ANC and the more power hungry it is, the more space you have to take up with a battery somewhere to keep it going for any length of time.
Right. And so if you're saying battery life shouldn't be the competition necessarily, that shouldn't be the benchmark.
Well, I look at it and say every time I walk down the street and you look around, you see everybody has that little square case hanging from their keychain now.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, when you look around, they're ubiquitous.
Mm-hmm.
So if everybody is carrying around a charging device with them full time,
yeah,
does the single charge, if it has to last 8 hours without putting it back in that case, really make that much of a difference? I can understand the not wanting it to be so short that it's annoying.
Yeah.
I'm halfway through a movie and they quit working. Okay, bad. I can see that, but it's one of those. And I guess for people that are on a plane, for an extended period, although I think you can plan for that, maybe that's where that comes in. But for most of us, if it's over a couple 3 hours for a movie or that kind of thing, how much longer do you really on average wear them for one sitting?
Yeah, you're not normally like having you're not normally like watching the Lord of the Rings trilogy like binge style on one charge. Regardless. Like it's not gonna that's not realistic benchmark. So that is interesting when you're bringing it up that way, that manufacturers have really put such a focus on that battery life thing, when I didn't ask for 8 hours. Did you?
Yeah, no. And I think, when it started out on our first few wireless models, we saw the battery life was really pretty abysmal. So it was one of those things where it was 90 minutes or it was, and I think that may have been where the battery life became such a big issue, when they didn't last for a whole movie. All at once, the ability to do that was pretty important. But I think we've gone beyond that now, where there's, is it really that important? Yeah.
So what would you like to see the focus move from, or like the gauge of quality in like what is like a top or a forerunner of the wireless headphone market right now? If it's not battery life, what are you looking at it as?
Balance.
Nice. Okay, let's hear about balance.
Well, let's look at balance. And
I like that word.
Yeah. I'm not advocating for short battery life. I'm just saying let's don't push long battery life above all else.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, to that point, again, on ANC, maybe I don't need the be all and end all of ANC that removes absolutely everything. If I can reduce sound enough to not be distracting from the outside and preserve battery some, then that becomes a nice happy medium. And then I can maintain size in a way that it's not hurting my ear to try and carry around this football.
On the back of your ear.
Yeah, things like that.
This episode of the eCoustics podcast is sponsored by Bowers Wilkins. Whether you're after pure luxury or everyday performance, their full headphone lineup has you covered. From the immersive PX7 S3 and flagship PX8 S2 to the sleek PI6 and PI8 earbuds, bring true sound wherever life takes you. Explore the collection at bowerswilkins.com.
But the other thing I think is really important, I say balance, is there's been this real drive, and anybody who's listened to very many ANC products has seen this phenomenon. There's been this real drive to come up with better and better ANC in the respect of getting rid of outside noise.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think it is focused equally heavily on preserving the sound signature of what was there to begin with.
Dude, preach it.
And the problem is that doesn't always show up on the target curves and the things like that either. So it's really one of those where until you put it on and listen to it, all the numbers in the world don't really help you figure this out. But, we're seeing a lot of that where this thing is fantastic at removing all of these outside noises. But the minute you turn ANC on, it just completely changes the complexion of the system.
It does. And, I thought that when I was what would that have been? A freshman in high school. And I thought that I was kind of done hearing like the MP3 warble of like a crappy download. I thought that sound was behind us. But with what I've experienced with really intense ANC, it can make that source material sound like a crappy Napster download.
Yeah, no, as I say, I think what you're calling the MP3 warble is what I used to refer to as songs from the pit, where it sounds like put the speaker in the bottom of a hole and tried to listen to it from from outside it.
Right.
But yeah,
and that doesn't show up on a curve, like you're saying, because it's still showing frequency. It's still showing, you can still have like a flat spectrum and you can see that on a graph or whatever, but it does sound like a pit or it does sound like an MP3
yeah,
warble.
it just doesn't sound right. Yeah, I was
Exactly.
saying, I think that's the thing is I want ANC to work in such a way that I have to look at the app to know if it's on or not.
Oh yeah. I love that.
That's what I want from my ANC is if I can't tell when I hit the button whether I turned it on or off, that's how it ought to work. Because the things I'm trying to hear shouldn't change.
That's true.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that's the balance that I think is being lost in a lot of this. In the race to get better and better ANC, we're not considering the fact that, in all cases, some are better than others, but it's not always considered as to what you're doing to the sound quality in order to do that. And you end up with this sort of lifeless sound that is boring, quite frankly, in a lot of cases, because you've taken out a lot of the dynamics in order to get the ANC to do what you wanted.
So I don't have a lot of experience with in-ears. And, I'll get there at some point in my life, I guess, maybe. They've just always made me so nervous for a lot of reasons. But are you seeing any like differences or positives, negatives, whatever you want to call them, between the wireless over-ear market in 2025 and the in-ear market in 2025?
I think they're very different markets. And what's really interesting about it is that, to your point, I think there are some very distinct market segments that maybe people don't realize. When you look at it and say, well, it's all the headphone market. Well, it is, but, to your, you were talking a minute ago before we came on about looking for a closed back headphone because you get some of your mic, picks up your audio from an open back, things like that. So I think there's a very big difference in studio users versus the casual listener versus the, various use cases for it, the gamer, just to pick out 2 or 3 market segments there. But I think what we've seen in a lot of cases is convenience is king.
Okay.
So I think the in-ears win on the convenience is king thing because you can keep them in your pocket. You don't have to take up a whole lot of space. They, the case will charge them where you don't have to remember to charge the actual headphone, things like that, quite as much. So I think there's a lot of people that have some brand, and obviously the AirPod is going to be the call out on that.
Right.
But when you walk down the street and you look at how many people have those, there's an entire segment of the population that basically uses those as their phone.
Absolutely.
They have one in their ear full time, and it's more a phone than it is anything else.
Right, and it's connected to a watch.
Yeah, I was going to say, I thought it was interesting. I wish I could remember where I read it, but one of the tech articles I was reading a while back was talking about the fact that something like 40% of AirPods had never played music.
Whoa.
That they were purely there so somebody had an in-ear phone. And I suspect that there's some truth to that,
Yeah,
and I think that again goes to those market segments. So who do you see? I think, obviously the ones that are running around with one ear pod in and talking on their phone, what their primary use case is. But when you consider that and then take a look at when you're traveling or things like that, you see a very different picture. If I'm wandering around the grocery store, I see a lot of people with a one earbud hanging from the side. If I get on the plane, everybody's wearing over ears.
Oh, that's interesting. I haven't traveled in a minute. And so I wonder why that is.
Well, I think part of it is the isolation, that none of the little in-ears typically provide as good isolation as your bigger ones do. And I say none of them, obviously CIEMs do, the ones that are custom fitted to your ear and things like that. But those are a considerably different market than the ANC overhead or over ear models. When you're talking about the Sony XM5 and XM6, the Bose QC
but is ANC technology as common? Like, is it normally integrated into in-ears, or is that like a standard? It just doesn't work as well flat out.
Well, no, it works, probably just about as well. Although I think there's, on balance, it works as well. We'll put it that way. Differences in models, differences in brands, but I don't think ANC has a really big plus minus for in-ear versus over-ear. I think what does have a plus for over-ear is long-term comfort.
That's true.
In that a lot of people just don't like the idea of having something shoved in their ear for hours at a time.
It's like my least favorite type of sweating.
Well, and I think that's
very uncomfortable.
Well, and I'll be the first to tell you, I've reviewed I don't even remember how many different earphones at this point. But one of the things you get into with that is there is a point in time when you start developing some physical fatigue from things poking you in the ear for a number of hours, where it's just plain uncomfortable.
Right.
And depending on the make of the model and that sort of thing, that can take anywhere from 20 minutes to 2.5, 3 hours to start showing up.
Mm-hmm.
But eventually it does. And I think people have a long memory for being uncomfortable.
That's fair.
So I think,
agree.
If you've ever been uncomfortable because you put something in your ear and it didn't fit very well and it annoyed you, the tendency is to look at it the next time and say, last time I did that, it didn't fit very well and it was uncomfortable and it annoyed me, so I'm not doing that again. So I think when you see people who know they're going to be stuck on a plane for a number of hours, that comfort is probably the overriding driver.
Yeah, and I mean, so I've started riding my BMX bike again. I haven't ridden since I was, 17-ish, and I'm 36 now. And I got a BMX bike and been riding again. And man, I remember those falls, right? And so that sense of like remembering uncomfortability, it shows up that way. And so I'm really being cautious in a lot of ways. But it's the same kind of thing with in-ears. Is, man, I was hit with like a frequency, not scroll, but a short cue, and then they were just rolling that frequency back and forth to find the feedback, and they didn't know or didn't realize whatever that they had that being sent to the in-ears, and I got hit. Dude, I got hit with that, and like, all done. I mean, I'll just give me a floor wedge, or when I'm doing things, I'm going to be having over ears on, and I really wish that wasn't the case, and I got to give it another try because I understand that's rare and not the main thing. That doesn't happen to many people, or else they wouldn't be selling all these in-ears. So I got to get over that hump myself. But yeah.
But like I said, I think it's one of those things where people do that. We have a long memory for things we didn't like, and sometimes we unfairly bias an entire category of products because of that one bad experience, and that's
I'm raising my hand. That's what I've essentially done, and I got to get over that. I
think we're all guilty of it at some point. Maybe not, with this particular market, but all of us have had a bad experience with something where we said, "I'm never doing that again," and it's
So you did mention in the last eCoustics episode, and this is something I wanted to bring up in this conversation, because now we've talked about battery, we've talked about balance, and we've talked about ANC, and we're also talking about both in-ears and over-ears. So this is like a really cool crash course, man. The other thing that you brought up in the 100th episode, which I had not heard of, but was really excited to hear about, was the processing moving from the headphone to the phone. And that made just a drastic amount of sense. What has more processing power, your headphone or your essential computer in your pocket or whatever? It's definitely going to be that. And so can you speak a little bit on that type of new tech?
Well, I think there are a lot of companies that are working on that, and that, to our point of, your battery life is limited by the processing power, you have in there. All right, so if we can move that somewhere else, it eliminates that space constraint and eliminates the having to have the battery, the big battery, the things like that, because now you're doing it on another system. So there are several companies that are looking at that. The other thing that potentially you have there is the ability to completely remove the ANC circuitry from the headphone entirely and do it all on the phone, so that, if they come up with a good enough algorithm for that, it doesn't matter whose headphone you have anymore.
No, it doesn't, because it's going to be the phone's microphone that will be measuring the
measuring the room and things like that. Yeah, because ultimately you really don't want to have to send things back and forth to a microphone on the ear in order to do it. Because that puts one of those restrictions right back into the mix. So, like I said, there are several companies that are playing with that. I've seen a couple of starter apps, things like that. NDAs on them say I can't say too much, but
you're saying enough. Like it's in development. I mean, I think is a milestone movement for headphones.
I'm not telling you who's doing it, but I can say they're definitely working on that prospect. That we're moving the things out of the headphone and somewhere else where you have the ability to take advantage of the processing power that everybody's carrying around.
Mm-hmm.
Because
wouldn't that make your headphones lighter too? I mean, potentially you're looking at a whole bunch of really cool things that can happen.
Potentially it does. Or you fill the same space that you did with the electronics with more battery, and it makes them last twice as long.
Man, if we're going for a 32-hour battery life.
Yeah, there are a number of possibilities there, but
wear them into your casket. Still going to be. It's
well, I think the funny thing with the phone though is that there was one of the NASA folks that was talking about the fact that they literally conducted the entire Apollo program with less computing power than the average Android. So nothing like making you feel like an underachiever, like realizing that they put man on the moon with less than you have on your phone. It's like, boy, am I not accomplishing a lot with this thing.
That's funny.
Happy listening from our sponsor, SVS. Acclaimed for punching well above their class, experience thrilling and immersive sound from SVS speakers, subwoofers, and cables at an affordable price. Join the sound revolution today. Visit svsound.com.
So I'm kind of jumping around here because there are just so many, I don't consider them small topics within this wireless conversation, because the wireless headphone, I don't know if I'm not counting the phones. I'm like mobile phones or smartphones. I'm not counting that.
Yeah,
everyone has these things. Everybody.
They do, but I think you can take a step back too and say, we keep talking about wireless headphones in this, and the respect that they're somehow different than the wired ones. And I think that what's really changed in the past 5 years has been the fact that we're having a lot of this conversation around wireless headphones because they've become immensely more popular, because they're immensely better than they were just a handful of years ago. And a lot of that change is with the improvements in the technology. It's not that the sound quality is necessarily any better, because that was never really the downfall to begin with. There's some limits. I'm not saying they're perfect, but even SBC was capable of delivering reasonable sound.
What's SBC?
The baseband protocol in Bluetooth.
Oh, thank you. Yep.
Yeah, the original Bluetooth or codec that was carrying sound. Even that is capable of decent. It's 1644. You're going to get basically MP3 320 quality kind of thing. It's not, it's not lossless and it's not perfect, but a lot of people listen to a lot worse all the time. So it's not terrible. But what's improved is they don't cut out near as much. You don't have to worry about, pairing's a lot easier. The repairing process is a lot easier where you pull them out and they immediately connect. They've become a lot less hassle and a lot more convenient. And now we're seeing a movement toward having enough bandwidth there to be able to really compete with a wired standard as far as quality goes. And, theoretically speaking, there's always going to be a bandwidth limit with wireless that's not there on a wired system. But the reality of it is we're not coming close to that most of the time because of the limits of how our music is encoded.
Right.
So if you think about the fact that the vast majority of music out there is at 1644, that's the CD standard. Pretty much everything industry-wide has been recorded to that. You can actually do that today. If you look at what's out there today, there are several of the codecs that will handle 1644, lossless. You've got aptX adaptive and lossless. You've got LDAX high end, which is getting there. You've got Bluetooth LE that is there. So the protocols are there arguably to support full speed, solid transmission of CD quality audio. So that was the first real knock on wireless as well. If you got Bluetooth and, you got dropouts all the time in that, and then you're suffering from the fact that it can't really deliver even CD quality audio on top of that. Well, you're talking, in 2017, 2018, wireless was not where it is today. But when you look at what we're dealing with today, and you're talking about, now you've got Focal that not only came out with their first wireless product here, a little over a year ago, year and a half now with the Batiste. Now they've got the Batiste MG that's a step above that takes the same physical headphone and puts the magnesium driver in it that's a step above what they did in the first time.
Have you heard those?
I have a set here now.
How are they?
They're fantastic.
Oh, that's cool. Because I remember the Batistes I really enjoyed those.
Absolutely.
I first heard those, but I have not heard the MGs.
Yeah, I think the Batiste and the Bowers and Wilkins PX8 were probably sort of co-champions, when they came out, and that both of them were really good for different reasons. The Batiste, a little more comfortable, didn't have quite the clamping force, didn't have quite the ANC, whereas the PX8 did have the ANC and still managed to retain the sound quality. So both of those are right up there. And now you've got both of those companies coming out with the successors to those. You've got the Focal with the Batiste MG. You've got Bowers and Wilkins that just came out with that PX7 S3. Also one I've got in to play with. It's very good, and we'll have a review of it up here in a little bit.
That's cool.
It's actually, the downside is it's got some features that are yet to come. So it's going to support Bluetooth LE and a firmware upgrade, but they're still working out some bugs.
Oh.
So it's, it may get delayed a little bit in the hope that we get that firmware update in before we finish the review. As good as it is, hopefully that'll make it better. But, we're seeing the market move to create some really high-end Bluetooth headphones, which I think is an indicator that the technology is there. The Focals and things like that are not going to put their name on one that they know isn't going to live up.
Yeah, for real.
So as we see some of these come in, we've seen a steady tick upward in the quality, and the companies that are coming into play. Sonos came out with their first one here not too long ago with the Ace. That honestly was, to my mind, a better built, better sounding AirPod Max.
Wow. Hey, if you're in that market though, that's a good thing to hear. So.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you're in the market for one of those, I'd certainly check out the Ace, because right now they're cheaper too. So things like that, we've seen the market evolve pretty dramatically. And I think there's going to come a point here where, again, that don't let perfect be the enemy of good enough. At what point do we quit talking about wired versus wireless and just talk about a headphone? I think
if it gets to that point, like, I'm ready for that conversation. Like, I personally don't use wireless. The only way that I can see things from a studio perspective, because I use multiple different types of headphones for all different things, right? But I spend a lot of my time in studio situations, and the only reason I don't really dig on wireless in the studio environment is because of digital artifact like crosstalk with old analog gear. Like, that still exists. You put
you're going to get a fair amount of problems in a studio environment because
your
of that.
RF noise and like tick 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 tick, that always will come through. So like,
well, I think there's also a possibility that you look at the same kind of problem but a different reason, and that is when you start talking about schools and places where you're got to have 50 of them in a room.
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
Are we going to continue to see use of wired things attached to testing systems and things like that at schools because you can't have a whole row of them set up and not have crosstalk or that kind of thing? So I think that may be one of the things that's yet to work through. Although with the new Bluetooth LE standards, you're definitely seeing movement in that direction.
Which is cool because I would love that to be the conversation of, we're just talking about headphones and whether it's wireless or wired, it doesn't matter anymore. But the reason that really did become, I think, a mainstream conversation was when the 3.5 jack got removed from phones.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And honestly, the 3.5 jack being removed from a phone didn't have diddly to do with sound. It had nothing to do with it. Had nothing to do with audio at all.
No,
and that's what I think most people don't realize, that they look at it and say, "Well, they removed that 3.5." Yeah, they removed the 3.5 because it was a hole straight into the core of the phone that let water in.
There you go. The insurance claims, the complaints. Everything. Exactly.
Basically, it was physically impossible to waterproof a phone that had that.
Mm-hmm. So I have a question for you. So and this is an ANC driven question. I have a pair of the Automotic Music Pro Elites, and those are earplugs, but they're active earplugs. So they take a charge. They've got a case. They act. You would think that they were in-ear headphones, but they are in fact ear plugs. And I've been using them quite a bit, and I'm starting to really kind of get used to them, and they do some really neat stuff for concerts.
I think there's been some technology like that that's come out. Several companies have been competing for years on the passive technologies, in that, we all know you don't want to go to a concert with nothing, because you're destroying your hearing to do it. Yeah, it's fun, right. But we were all kids once and we did that, and our ears rang for 2 days, and now we know better.
Right, and the earplugs are getting so much better, where you can still hear very well, like what you're saying. Like, give me the ANC that I don't know is on. Like, earplugs are starting to do that stuff.
They are. And I think there was, what I was saying was, I think there was a time when a lot of companies were putting a lot of effort into coming up with passive ways to reduce the amount of sound without reducing the quality of sound.
Correct.
Yeah. And that's a tough thing to do, because the problem is every material sort of cuts out different frequencies at different rates.
Mm-hmm.
So anytime you put something in front of the ear, it's going to cut out some frequencies more than others. It's real easy to tell, even with El Cheapos. Go out and get yourself a couple of sets of foam earplugs and a couple of sets of the silicone ones, and then listen to things around the house with them in, and you'll figure out very quickly that the difference in media is attenuating different sounds to different degrees.
Correct.
So trying to come up with something in the way of a passive that would attenuate all frequencies to the same degree, so what reaches the ear sounds unaltered, is a very tough thing to do.
It is.
And I think that's why when you start looking at things like the Automotic, that they're going to that active model, is because what the intention is, if I can cut out 100% of what you hear natively, so nothing is making it through that, which they can't quite do, but we'll give them credit for the time being. But if I can cut out everything that's there natively so that the only thing you're hearing is what I feed you, then I can take the outside sound and I can manipulate that and pass it to you at whatever level I choose.
Yeah, parallel compression.
Right. And I don't have the issue with trying to find a material that attenuates things to the same level because I'm doing it electronically.
Right. And so what I'm wondering, though, is that software, that active processing, is that something that is being marketed or is already in a lot of these wireless headphones where like you wouldn't have to carry earplugs and your earbuds with you to a show? It just doesn't make sense to me that they wouldn't be one and the same.
Well, they're not one and the same in the respect that you're using the tools for different purposes, but they are pretty much one and the same in the respect that the same pieces are there.
Right.
And what I mean by that is if you have ANC, you're listening to an outside mix as part of what you're doing because the goal is to see what the noises are on the outside and then get rid of them. So essentially what happens with that is if you and I know you do, but for the sake of the audience, if you understand the idea that when you bring in a sound and you look at the frequency and the amplitude of that sound, if you want to get rid of it, you look at flipping the wave. So you want something that's equal and opposite. So same amplitude, opposite spot on the curve. And then you play them both. They both hit the ear, they cancel each other out. And what you end up hearing is neither.
Yep, you're just working in phase cancellation.
Right. So you're canceling out based on the phase. So what you're doing with an ANC is using that outside mic, then flipping the signal and sending it on. So what comes through naturally is then canceled out by what you flipped and done electronically.
Right.
So the technology's there. You're right. You've got the outside microphone. You've got the ability to do, but it's being used in a different way. So could they program an in-ear to do that? Absolutely. Has it been something that a lot of these makers are doing? No, but I'd expect somebody like an Etymotic will probably pick up that banner.
Yeah, I would hope so because, the amount of different, like, I'm talking about in-ears just for a moment because we're talking about earplugs, but the amount of different tips that you can put on those all make such a drastic difference on what the sound is, and B, the fit is, and C, what the cancellation is overall. And they all work differently for different environments, but dang, if I didn't have to cart around, headphones, earplugs, and in-ears, and I could just be like, oh, these tips here are the ones for my, when I'm using my in-ears as earplugs. That to me just makes a lot of sense as a consumer. Less things to lose.
No, I agree. And when you've got most of the technology in there, it's more a matter of being able to, to pick and choose which of the functions you want at any given time. So there's probably a little more electronic you'd have to add in order to have that mode switching and that kind of thing. But like I said, a lot of the pieces are already there.
And the Etymotics work good. The Etymotics that I have, I've been really pleased. Once I get the fit right, if they don't fit right in my ear, they're all I don't dig them. They just are more like just a foam earplug at that point, which is fine. It's just protection, but it's not fidelity. But man, when they're in right, I'm happy. They're cool.
I think the other cool thing we're seeing that, separate of the, moving away from the wireless for a minute is we're seeing, Biodynamic, for example, just came out with 3 new in-ears that are wired. But if you look at them and you look at the specs and the packaging and everything else, they're the same in-ear. But you've got 3 different tunings. They're getting smarter about marketing to the musicians and things in that, if you're a drummer or a bass player or a singer or a guitarist or, there's different needs. So,
absolutely.
Yeah. So, instead of having to have somebody at the mixing board who's delivering different mixes to each person, you have the ability to tailor that to some degree with your in-ears.
I love that.
Yeah, to me that's a great move, and I love seeing that because it's less expensive for a lot of people who are starting out to be able to get a couple of different kinds of in-ears than it is to have the big mixing board and all the ability to deliver different mixes to different people on the stage.
Well, yeah, and then you're in the control of your own ears, and you don't have someone that was the word earlier, sweeping an EQ in my ears that I didn't ask for. Like, and so there is,
it still depends on who's sending you what, but I think
exactly.
But I think the idea that a lot of these companies are now acknowledging the fact that at different times you need different things.
Mm-hmm.
And back to that balance thing, I look at it and say, in this case, it's an acknowledgement that there's only so much you can do with an EQ. So they're doing some of it in the in-ear itself to increase one frequency or cut another, things like that, where, obviously your drummer basically, has a very different mix. Your bass player needs the drummer and a little bit of everything else in it, kind of thing. Your singer probably wants more of themselves and less of everybody else,
Just themselves.
Yeah, as I say, so there's a difference in each of those. But, the fact that there's an acknowledgement that not everyone is going to work for everybody, which I think is great.
Yep.
I think there's been too much emphasis in the market in recent years on trying to hit the Harman target curve or make it look like this shape or do that kind of thing. And I've kind of always shied away from talking about that too much or putting a whole lot of faith in it, just to be honest, because I've always said, I don't mind using EQ because I don't think it tells me the product has a problem. I think it tells me my hearing's probably a little different than yours.
Sure. I mean, absolutely. Yeah.
And the likelihood that a product is going to be perfect for all of us is pretty slim, so not only the fact that they are engaging more in creating better EQs for some of these and making sure the drivers are responsive to EQ, because there's some of these where you can change the EQ from one end to the other and you can't hear the difference. Right. But the fact that they're also moving to tuning some of these at the factory for different purposes and admitting, hey, these are the same physical product but tuned differently, I think is a good thing for the market, because it acknowledges some of the things that all of us who've been in this industry for any length of time knew, but everybody was busily trying to kind of ignore. I think, the idea that, I've heard it said a million times, well, you shouldn't have to EQ. Well, if you want to go down that route, go ahead, but you're cutting off about 80% of the market. And there's a lot of really good product out there that with a little EQ sounds phenomenal. Mm-hmm. And I'm more than willing to say it's probably my ear that's the problem and not your product.
Well, and on that same accord, and we're wrapping here. I'm sick of neutrality, man. I'm like so burnt out on it, of like how it's like our product sounds just like the source material. It sounds exactly how the other person wanted this to hear, how it did in the booth, or blah, blah, blah. I'm so sick of that. Like the majority of microphones I use all have have voicings that are, they move you.
There's going to be some coloration to sound regardless. And that's, the idea that it's as the artist intended. My contention would be, unless you were there at the time to hear it, you don't know what the artist intended. You might come close, but how do you know? Mm-hmm. But the other thing I will say, while you're saying I'm sick of neutrality, I'm kind of the opposite end of it. And that is, I think we have now come to expect a boosted low end as normal. I'm seeing a lot of people that say, well, that thing doesn't have any low end to it. We've got companies like Odyssey coming out with entire technologies around trying to boost the low end sound of of an electrostatic and things like that. And I get it. We all like that visceral thump that kind of wakes you up and knocks you out of your seat, and the bombs going off in Top Gun, and things like that. But is it real? And really, most of this incredibly low frequency sound is digital. Mm-hmm. If you go back a few years, there were very few instruments in the analog world that were capable of delivering that kind of sounds, and they weren't used very commonly. The big timpani drums are probably the one clear cut case of where you really got down into that.
Yeah, if you want to take it to synths, you can make an argument for Moogs.
Well,
like,
I mean, yeah, you could make an argument for your string bass. I think it's 37, 40 hertz at the low end.
That'll go
But
real low. Yeah.
yeah, but how often do you play that low?
As often as I can.
It can, but realistically,
Yeah.
when you look at most music, it doesn't live in that bottom
No,
octave.
it doesn't. No, it doesn't.
So this trend toward more and more bass as the normal, I think is very much a digital trend. I think it's very much a new trend.
Do you think that, and the hyping of the bass, just because sound is physical, and the space that low end takes up, this is just a question to you. If there's more bass, wouldn't that be less battery life?
Oh, absolutely. Anytime you use more energy, physically bass has to, the way you create bass is move large quantities of air large distances.
Exactly.
And in order to do that, there's a fair amount of energy that's involved in doing it. So yeah, it does. On your wireless products, it is going to take away from the battery life to some degree. Not as much as some other things, but it does.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, like I said, I think that I'm not opposed to it.
No,
just don't call it neutral.
I agree with that.
Truly neutral, it should be truly neutral. And, but what has become the accepted, this is a normal sound signature, does have an elevated bass component to it in today's world.
Mm-hmm. Well, so can we wrap real quick here? And I agree with you. And I don't know if that's a cultural shift or if that's a shift that like consumers have asked for, or it's just a shift in how manufacturers want to make things. We can talk about that in another episode.
I think the consumers have driven that one, but we can pick that one up.
I like that.
Episode, but
when we wrap, can you mind? I know we've said some manufacturers in this episode, which is really cool. If you could pick a wired over ear, a wireless over ear, and an in ear for halfway through 2025 that you think are doing some cool things, what would those three be?
Oh, well, I think we hit the Carbon 2. Electrostatic is the wired over.
It's that good.
It is that good. And Odyssey continues to innovate. And that's part of why I want to put it out there. Is there have been some other ones, I mentioned the Hi-Fi Man Safara unveiled. That's fantastic as well. But I don't know that I think it's as innovative as what you see with the technology in the Carbon 2. So I'm going to highlight Odyssey there because I think not only is it a spectacular headphone, but I appreciate what they're doing in driving the market.
Okay.
So I think I'd go there. I think in that mid-market, on the wireless headphone, I'm going to take kind of a detour there and say I love the Batiste MG. That's obviously one of my picks of right now. But I think that Bowers and Wilkins PX7S3 is going to really surprise people.
How much is that one?
I'm going to have to go back and look. I want to say $599, but it isn't inexpensive, but it's not crazy expensive. And
when I'm hearing B&W, I'm not expecting a $599 price point. So that's really cool to hear.
Yeah. Well, you have to remember the PX8 is still technically a step above it. I don't know that I believe it sounds like it's a step above it right now. Well, there's got to be a PX9 coming. I mean, we all know it's, matter of time. But yeah, the PX7 is their step down model, and it's been kind of consistently updated, and it's now dipping at the heels of its bigger brother if it hasn't surpassed it.
Very cool.
So I think that's the one I'd throw in there. For the other one I'd throw in there with that is the Noble Focus Apollo. It's won all kinds of awards here in the last year and a half, since, or really, I should say year. It's not even been a year and a half since it started showing up on the market. And it's another one that's in about that same price space and is extremely good. And it's really, one of those where it probably comes closer to, okay, I can turn the ANC on and off and be hard to tell.
All right.
Yeah, the ANC is not as good as it is on something like the Sony as far as getting rid of every noise, but it is good in the respect that it's not damaging the sound signature. So I'll throw their name out there too. In-ear
And then
market's,
in-ear, yeah.
in-ear market's tougher. And I say that partially because we're kind of between cycles. There have not been a ton of new releases, from the big names right in here. There's always a steady stream of new stuff coming in. But you've seen the Sony XM6 over-ear is out, but the in-ear is not shown up yet.
Okay.
Bose, the Ultras are still their top end. So they've been sitting in the market 10, 12 months now. So, we're seeing some of those come in. I think the newest one I've got into review right now is a Noble as well. It's the Focus Amadeus. It's their little in-ear. It's actually really nice, but,
How does that, what about Shure stuff?
Shure tends to be more cautious and more long game. They don't release a whole lot of new products, but their line has been designed towards studio and been around forever. And they're kind of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Okay, gotcha.
That's
good to
kind
hear.
of
Sure.
That's kind of the way they roll. I think Westone is similar in that regard, in that they don't come out with a new one every 6 months or that kind of thing. But they've been in the market forever for musicians, and their durability tends to be more of a play for them as well, that they build to a higher quality standard in some regards, because they know they're going to get thrown in a gig bag.
Yeah, that's true.
So,
well, thanks so much for this conversation today. And I want to have another one too, just because there's so much going on in this space. We didn't even touch on immersive audio, and I love that. So definitely room for further conversations. And
always glad to be here.
No, man, yeah, and I love hanging with you, as you know. So this has been great. William Jennings, eCoustics headphones and portables editor, and I'm your producer, and I've been your host for this one, Mitch Anderson. Thanks, everybody. Subscribe, hit us up with some questions or comments. Let us know what you're listening through and to. We'll see you on the next one.